Okay, good evening, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. Greetings to everyone from wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much for joining this session. This session forms part of today's theme, which is building a new knowledge base for South feminist activism, making the invisible visible, queer visions for South feminist solidarity and internationalism. My name is Catherine Robinson. I'm a queer feminist based in Johannesburg, South Africa. And I was going to be facilitating the session with the amazing Phumi Mthethwa, but unfortunately, Phumi is unwell. So health comes first. So she gave us love and solidarity. So I will have to moderate this without her, unfortunately. But just a shout out to Phumi, who helped co-create this session with me. So thank you to Phumi. And also just a special thanks to South Feminist Futures for creating the space for South feminists to build solidarity and to share struggles and to resist white cis-het patriarchal supremacy and to reimagine South feminist queer futures and to advance our struggle for emancipation and self-determination for queer, trans, gender fluid, and non-binary folks across the world. And this is especially apt as we mark International Human Rights Day today. And it's also the close of 16 days of activism. And we know that cis-het patriarchal supremacy manifests into multiple human rights violations, and it results in discrimination, incarceration, hate crimes, violence, murder of trans, queer, and non-binary folk. So just a few housekeeping and administrative issues. Feel free to use the Q&A function in the Zoom tab. Please do also use the chat to introduce yourself. We'd love to know where you are and where you're from and who you are. But if you'd like to field questions later on when we open the floor, please use the Q&A function. There is translation in Spanish, Portuguese, French, and English, so please feel free to engage in your preferred language. Please do amplify this conversation on social media. Our Twitter hashtag is @SouthFeministas. We're also on Facebook, South Feminist Futures, and the hashtag is South Feminist Fest. So please do amplify, and this will also be live broadcast on those platforms. So thank you very much. Before we get into the conversation, I'd like to introduce our opening artist, Ceci Bugbo. She is a feminist, poet, and singer from Kenya. So over to that intervention.
Here. Dunia, dunia, dunia tunapita. Dunia, 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 dunia tunapita. Mama dunia, dunia tunapita. These are the last words of a dying poet. Phrases stuck in their throats, metaphors painted in blood, syllables bathed in the stomach bone of the knowledge that this moment here is all there is. These are the very words of a woman darkened into queer contortions, spitting out rainbows, space shifting, changing themselves with every scar and wound. Words as stubborn as the backs of the women who have walked before me. They don't break, they're everything and more. They're here and now. These are the tongues of all the freedom fighters and revolutionaries. These words are the fists in the air, in rebellion, the chants that have marked our being. This is us. We don't die. For birds flying high, you know how I feel. It's a new day. It's a new dawn for me. And I'm feeling good. These are the songs of the Queen Mothers of Rebirths. The very words as we pray the devil back to hell. Now we are stamping our feet against the very ground that buried us. This is a war cry screaming. Here we are with our complicated routings, our hairs held in kinky knots, our footprints a sign that we are here, fist in the air. These chains can't hold us now. Our dreams untamed, flying past glass ceilings into the sky. These obstacles can't stop us now, chanting and chanting and chanting. Freedom, freedom, I can't move. Freedom, cut me loose. Freedom, freedom, where are you? 'Cause I need freedom too. If this is the last time that I stand, let it be known that I lived in an age where we fought back. Let them know that I fought back. Let them know that I saw women take their spaces, that I stood in a room full of women without chains. Tell them that I saw a day like this when alliances were made and we pushed back with our hands held together. Tell them that I stood here as a witness, chanting back the spirit of Madikizela. Tell them that I was speaking in tongues back from the accents of the rain women. Tell them accents as stubborn as my ancestors. Tell them blessing us from the south to the north, the west to the east. Tell them that these are the roaring words of the Nile, the grains of the sand in the Sahara and Kalahari. Tell them these words are as complicated as the Congo forest and defying as the pyramids, coming through with the whispers of the wind and roaring of the mighty waves of the oceans that hold us. And right in this moment, I am free. I am all of us. I am everything. I am all that is here. I am this silence. I am here and free, and no amount of chains can rein that in. For these are the words of a dying poet, the dirge of a lost musician, the embodiment of a sculptor, the testimony of a people united, that on this day you witness the poet burst into flames.
Viva, that was a really incredibly powerful piece, Ceci. Thank you so much, and apologies. Ceci identifies as they, that is their preferred pronoun. Ceci, thank you so much. Darkened into queer contortions, tongues of a freedom fighter, fists in the air. We are stamping on the ground that buried us. We don't die. Freedom cuts me loose. Thank you so much. That was incredibly, incredibly powerful. Ceci, I welcome you to share a little bit about yourself and about this piece.
Hi, I don't know, can you hear me? All right, cool. My name is Sisi Babo. My pronouns they, them, theirs. I am a non-binary person living in Kajiado, Kenya. About this piece, I've been doing poetry singing, not much, but poetry and dance for a while now. And I think that was since 2014. And my first poem, I wrote it because there was a time in Kenya that women were being stripped naked on the streets. It came from a place of, patriarchal ownership of women's bodies, of you are not dressed the way we want you to, or the way we think is decent enough for us. So that is what brought me to performance poetry, because before that I was just writing poems and keeping them. But that time I think I was angry enough to act and go on stage and rave about everything that happened and how unhappy I was. And then this piece, I wrote it last year when I attended a conference about Beijing 25, that now that is this year, but last year, the preparations and everything before COVID. And the one thing that stayed with me throughout that meeting is how there was so many African women in that room, and how there was that need to push, but at the same time noticing that in the entire room, I was the only queer person. And I wasn't even there as one of the panelists or anything. I was simply there as an attendee. I don't know, like I was just attending. And that really stayed with me. So when I got out of that place again, inspired poetry, I wrote it down and I wrote it to dance to it. I didn't write it to perform it. Yeah. And after that, yeah, that's how this piece came to life. It came from that place of noticing the lack of queer people in mainstream feminist spaces, and the lack of non-binary people too. Yeah.
Thanks, Ceci. It's an important point, and something we need to push back and caution against, because, and we're seeing, of course, the word feminism being appropriated by trans exclusionary right-wing fascists. So yeah, it's incredibly important that we also reclaim our space within feminism, and also push back against progressive language and trans exclusionary feminism. So thanks for raising that. Before you go, where can people see more of your work? How can they follow you? How can they get in touch with you?
Okay, so I'm mostly on Twitter. I'm really vocal on Twitter about queer rights, trans rights. I'm really vocal on Twitter. So on Twitter is @sbagbo, and on Facebook is Sisi Babo. And on Facebook, I write stories. I write stories about feminism. I write stories like, I'm just a storyteller on Facebook. On Instagram, I'm Sisi Babo, again, @Sisi Babo. And I just started a page for queer people, visibility of Black queer people. And that one too, you can find it there. It's called The Bambies. So you could check out The Bambies. It is I and my partner, and we just like talk about, we have Saturdays where we just talk about being queer in a country first that considers you an issue, and what that looks like, knowing that things like 2/3 gender rule and all that doesn't involve people like me who are non-binary, because the parliament doesn't consider like, oh, non-binary, trans folk. No, it's the traditional binaries. So yeah, that's how you can find me.
Thank you so much. Hopefully maybe you can also just type that in the chat for us, or at least your tag, so we can follow you on Twitter. Thank you so much, Sisi, for your work. We send you love, power, and solidarity. Thanks for sharing your art and your politics with us. Thank you. Yeah, we're going to continue with the show. So just to give a bit of a context to this session, this workshop, as I said earlier, falls under the theme for today, which is building a new knowledge base for South feminist activism, with the aim of exploring and amplifying queer perspectives on repression, resistance, and queer visions for the reconstruction of broader society now and in the future. We hope to reflect on the historical LGBTQ+ struggles for freedom and self-determination, to inform current struggles against racial capitalism, patriarchy, colonialism, and the carceral state's use of excess force and police brutality to fortify its hegemony. And as we envision a new knowledge base for South feminist activism, we'll collectively attempt to reimagine internationalism and South solidarity as a daily and lived practice. I'd like to start, this is going to be a kind of an open dialogue and free-flowing conversation. We've got some questions we'd like to explore, but I'd like to just start off by introducing our speakers and guests. First, we have Anari Zapata. She is a Black, Garifuna, and Honduran transgender woman who arrived in the United States in 2015, fleeing the repression of her country. She has experience helping LGBTQIA+ migrants and connecting them with resources they need to survive. Anari has also participated in protests and in many conferences as a speaker, and has also testified in court, fighting for the rights of LGBTQIA+ folks, Black folks, and individuals who identify as women. And her goal is to help create a world where our gender and sexuality are free to be lived and expressed. Then I'd like to introduce Narika Naja. She is based in India. She is a writer, researcher with interests in history, archaeology, gender, technology, and the internet. And finally, Rula Seghaya. She is a transnational feminist writer and novelist, focused on migration, labor, and reproductive justice. She is the co-founder of Migrant Workers Task Force and Intersectional Knowledge Publishers. She is a migrant in Beirut, Lebanon, where she works on issues of the informal economy, particularly in relation to domestic work. She is also part of a feminist cooperative working on the creation of an alternative economic model and justice systems. And she counsels women, non-binary, and trans folks on matters of gender, sexuality, bodily autonomy, and reproductive justice. So, you know, when we came into this call to check out tech, I didn't really get to greet you all properly. So thank you so much, but we've been communicating over the last few hours. So just to welcome you into the space and thank you so much. We're so grateful to have you in this space. So Anari can only join us for 1 hour. So I'd like to just hand the mic over to Anari just to explore this first question, and then Rula, and then Narika. Questions about, you know, what are we having to confront? Our lived experiences of racism, xenophobia, queer and transphobia, police brutality, austerity, and white cishet supremacy. How do we make these hegemonies visible? And what does it mean to give visibility to this invisible, it's hardly invisible hegemonic power? Anari, may I pass the mic to you to start this conversation?
Ok, buenos días. Bueno, al menos aquí en Estados Unidos es la mañana. Buenos días, nuevamente Anari Zapata. Estoy muy agradecida por este espacio. Es la primera vez que estoy en un panel que está basado en África. Soy garífuna. Son negros africanos que emigraron para el norte de América hace más de 200 años atrás. Y yo siempre he dicho, en la actualidad en la que nosotros vivimos, el simple hecho de ser negro es como es una gran problemática, el hecho de nuestro color de piel en la sociedad en la que estamos viviendo. Y ya cuando tenemos que sumarle el somos negros, somos LGBT, somos mujeres, porque hay tantos estigmas que han puesto para nosotros a lo largo de la vida. Siempre he dicho eso, se espera del hombre negro, desde que nace ya lo están guiando a un futuro social que la sociedad le ha dado a la mujer negra. Entonces tenemos que abolir todo el sistema en el cual vivimos. Siempre he dicho, para que nosotros podamos vivir libremente como negros, necesitamos una abolición de todo el sistema y volver a recrear un sistema en el cual nosotros podamos estar con libertad. Y eso está en todos los poderes del Estado en el cual nosotros hemos vivido a lo largo de la vida, desde que hablamos de la religión, de la política, de leyes, todo ha sido creado para personas blancas y para dominar a la comunidad negra, para dominar al negro, para dominar a la mujer. Ayer hablaba sobre el por qué en mi infancia yo pasé por muchas religiones, porque siempre me cuestionaba el por qué a quien yo miro en el altar, a la imagen de Dios que yo veía, por qué era un Dios blanco y por qué era prácticamente incierto o ilegal o no permitido poder imaginarnos a un Dios negro. Entonces siempre nos han guiado de una manera indirecta a pensar de que hay algo malo en nosotros y debemos adaptar costumbres ajenas. Ok, ¿por qué me tengo que imaginar que mi Dios es un Dios blanco y que hay algo malo en ser negro? Entonces, se han creado sistemas que no están siendo representados por nosotros. Muchas veces he visto en las gobernaciones que habla dique a favor del negro, persona blanca, persona que nunca ha vivido lo que he vivido yo por ser negra. Entonces, si no has vivido lo que he vivido, no puedes representarme porque no sabes lo que yo siento. No, hay privilegios en ser blanco y hay personas que están en el gobierno hablando por el negro, pero no reconoce su privilegio sobre mí. Entonces no me puede representar, no puede representar a la comunidad LGBT, alguien que no es LGBT, alguien que no sabe lo que siente una mujer transgénero negra, alguien que no sabe lo que siente un hombre gay, una mujer lesbiana, una persona queer, es una persona no binaria, quien no sabe lo que se está sintiendo, no puede representar. Entonces ha venido después de que nos pisoteaban, que nos han pisoteado durante muchos años, ahora que estamos creando poder entre nosotros, que nos estamos empoderando, porque es la comunidad negra la única que apoya a la comunidad negra, es la comunidad LGBT la única que apoya a la comunidad LGBT. Entonces, ahora que están viniendo a ver estos factores que estamos logrando gracias a la social media y gracias al conocimiento que están entrando a nuestros países, que hemos logrado organizarnos, entonces ahora quieren hacer marketing con nosotros. Ustedes pueden ver que, al menos aquí en América, cuando es el mes del orgullo LGBT, los gobernantes ponen una bandera del orgullo en sus perfiles de la social media, las tiendas se decoran de arcoíris, pero todo es marketing, solo es para que, ok, aquí los estamos aceptando, pero cuando les toca poner en práctica las realidades, siempre nos excluyen. Entonces hacen un marketing para que ellos queden bien, pero cuando les toca hacer representación en sus gobiernos, no piensan en nosotros. La comunidad LGBT siempre le ha tocado ir a las calles, luchar, hacer protestas, hacer conferencias, gritar, manchar paredes, para que les puedan medio aceptar. Y no es justo porque ellos saben que estamos aquí. Somos seres que votamos, somos seres que pagamos impuestos, somos seres que estamos en la sociedad siendo doctores, abogados, maestros, estamos siendo todos los roles que la sociedad tiene con sí, pero aún así no nos respetan. Entonces, lo que yo puedo pensar, lo que siempre digo yo es abolir todo, abolir el patriarcado, abolir el machismo, porque algo que siempre he dicho, las personas que han sido perseguidas durante años, que han sido dominadas, a cierto punto quieren tener el poder de perseguir a otros o de dominar a otros. Y esto es lo que pasa, pienso, con el hombre negro. El hombre negro ha sido muy pisoteado por la sociedad. Entonces, lo único que tiene a su alcance es a la mujer. Entonces, quiere dominar a la mujer negra porque ha sido un hombre dominado durante muchos años. Entonces, tenemos que hacer reformas desde la educación que estamos dando en nuestras casas. Siempre he dicho, puedo tener un mundo dado vuelta, pero si empiezo a cambiar al niño que está en mi casa, a la niña, a la persona que estoy criando, voy a tener la paz de que estoy haciendo una transformación para un mundo que viene. Pero si estamos tratando de hablar de todo lo que está pasando ahorita en el 2020, de lo que somos adultos en el 2020, y estamos ignorando a la persona que se está criando ahorita, estamos criando la misma sociedad dada vueltas, porque esta persona que no está comprendiendo de que hay diversidad sexual, que hay diversidad de color, que hay diversidad de pensamiento, y se está criando allá en lo absurdo, en la oscuridad, en la falta de conocimiento, dentro de 10, 15 años va a ser un adulto sin ese conocimiento. Y va a ser un adulto nuevamente maltratador, nuevamente maltratado, nuevamente sin principios. Entonces, la manera en la que podemos transformar es si nos centramos mucho en la niñez de hoy. Necesitamos ir a los hogares de los niños y que estos niños sepan de que ellos, lo que nace entre sus piernas no les define. Que ellos sepan de tener una vagina no te hace mujer, tener un pene no te hace hombre, que no solo está la posibilidad de ser hombre y mujer, sino de que puede ser lo que tú quieras ser, lo que tú te identifiques en ser. Entonces necesitamos esta libertad de pensamiento y esta libertad de ser, en la libertad de ser, en la que tú puedas sentirte pleno con quien tú eres, ¿no? Entonces, cuando empezamos a transformar personas o permitirles a las personas ser, estamos cambiando una vida. Hace 5 años atrás, cuando yo vivía en Honduras, tengo 5 años viviendo en Estados Unidos. Hace 5 años atrás yo ni siquiera sabía que yo era una mujer transgénero. Yo sentía que había algo diferente en mí, pero en el pueblo en el que yo me crecí nunca miré una mujer transgénero. Nunca, ¿no? Entonces yo migré para Estados Unidos porque sentía que no cabía, que no había un espacio en mí. Cuando yo llegué aquí, he venido a ver 1000 cosas, que no digo que Estados Unidos sea lo mejor del mundo, pero al menos me ha dado esa oportunidad de ser, ¿no? Y yo siempre me digo, ¿por qué no pude ser en mi casa? ¿Por qué no pude ser allá? Porque es triste irte desde tu país a hablar otro lenguaje, no tener documentación, o cuando aprendes inglés tienes un inglés con otro acento al que ellos consideran de que, no, este es un migrante y ahora es la barrera de ser un migrante en un país ajeno. ¿Por qué no podemos permitirle a las personas ser dentro de nuestros entornos y no estar formando estas fugas cerebrales de que las personas tienen que huir, y cuando las personas huyen recursos, ¿no? Porque yo era una maestra de educación primaria en mi país, entonces huyó una maestra, ¿no? Y ese es un recurso que pudo haberse utilizado en mi comunidad garífuna. Yo quiero ser abogada en un futuro. Este era un recurso que mi comunidad pudo haber tenido, pero no, tuve que venir y huir, y todos esos recursos se pierden. Y yo creo que muchas veces los gobiernos, nuestros gobernantes, no piensan en esa parte de que no solo estás pisoteando a una persona, sino que todo lo que esa persona conlleva. Y siempre cuando pienso en las personas que están sufriendo en África, yo sé de que hay mucho talento. Nunca he estado en África, pero tengo muchas amistades africanas, veo muchos reportajes y sé cuánto talento hay y sé cuán estudiados, cuán inteligentes son las personas queers, y sé cuánto pueden aportar y cuánto se está perdiendo por la simple y sencilla razón de que no se les está aceptando. que no se les está aceptando y no se les está haciendo espacios para vivir. Hay países también en las que, como el país en el que yo vivo, en el que dicen que no criminalizan la homosexualidad porque no les meten presos, pero es ilegal casarse, es ilegal adoptar. Entonces, si tú no me estás permitiendo llevar una vida social igual que cualquier otra persona, sí me estás criminalizando. Por más que no estoy en la cárcel, si no me estás permitiendo poder casarme, si deseo casarme, es criminalizar a una persona, es arrastrarla a la oscuridad y decirle, no, tú ve allá al banquillo de los acusados porque tú no puedes estar aquí entre todos nosotros. Entonces, hay mucho que cambiar, hay mucho que abolir, empezando por la religión. Empezando por la religión, porque he pensado durante mucho tiempo que la religión es quien nos ha dividido entre el que tiene, el que no tiene, porque para la religión el asesinato es pecado solo si el pobre mata al rico. Cuando es al contrario, eso lo van a excusar de cualquier otra manera. Solo si el negro mata al blanco es pecado. Todo lo contrario, van a buscar una manera de excusarlo. Entonces necesitamos crear un mundo en el que podamos estar todo en paz y para eso tenemos que abolir todo, abolir. Tenemos que derrumbar las paredes con las que criaron esta sociedad y volverlas a hacer. Y yo sueño un mundo en el que no tenga que ir afuera y festejar porque el presidente es negro, porque no va a ser ninguna novedad. Sí, tengo un presidente negro, ya viene otro y vendrán cualquier otros más. Entonces no hay una novedad en ello. Un mundo en el que una mujer pueda salir y vestirse como quiera. Hace unos días en Instagram miré de que una persona hizo una pregunta, ¿qué harías en un mundo sin hombres? Y la mayoría de las mujeres hablaban, podré salir en una minifalda totalmente libre, podrés caminar en las calles sin miedo, y me daba cuenta tantos miedos que había ante el hombre, y es por la sociedad, es por la manera en la que se crió el hombre y la manera en la que se crió a la mujer. Entonces yo quiero que dentro de 10 años una mujer pueda ir a la calle y caminar como que no hubieran hombres, habiendo hombres, porque ella va a caminar en su minifalda y no la van a perseguir, no la van a piropear, no la van a violar, no la van a matar, ¿no? O un mundo que se pueda vivir en el que todos seamos humanos, en el que no importa quién es hombre, quién es mujer, quién es LGBT, quién es nada, porque todos somos hermanos. Y para eso tenemos que cambiar lo que hay en nuestras casas. Para eso tenemos que formar a la niñez que está en nuestras casas.
Annery, thank you so much for that contribution. You've touched on almost everything we need to confront and abolish. You've touched on anti-Blackness and how it intersects with LGBTQ identity, and you've touched on how white supremacy intersects across all these different isms and phobias and different hegemonies. And I mean, you've touched on so much. And I just wanted to go back to, you were speaking about the colonial white supremacist and also religious underpinnings of anti-Blackness and of transphobia and queerphobia, and how that is cushioned and protected by the state, and how patriarchy and white supremacy rely on racism. They rely on the gender binary to uphold their supremacy. And of course, you spoke a lot about pink washing as well, how they'll fly our flags when it suits them, but when it comes to recognizing who we are and upholding our human rights, that doesn't happen. So thanks for raising that, and thanks for your contribution. Narika, would you like to respond? Add to this?
besides nodding my head very vigorously in agreement to everything that Anari has said, there's one of the things that I was thinking of is like when I was introduced and I was said, you said I'm from India, and that's technically true, and that's an identity that I need to carry. But there's a deeper identity that I think I hold, and that's as someone who comes from the south of India, from a place called Tamil Nadu, from Chennai. My identity is more closely linked to my language. And when we talk of colonialism and cis patriarchy and things like that, I think that's something that I will hold a lot more deeper to me than the identity of being an Indian person, right? And so there are within our own such identities, there are lots of other things that come and sort of come and go and sort of invisibilize some things and not invisibilize other things. So while I might technically fall under the as a person of color or something like that, but then I have certain privileges within my country that other people may not have. I come from a privileged background. I come from in India, you can't have conversations without talking about caste in social circles. In circles of human rights, we can't talk about just class or identity or things like that without talking about how our caste backgrounds influence how we take these things. And so I come from a dominant caste family, which gave me access to extremely high quality education, which gave me access to a lot of things, which allowed me to travel the world, study in other parts of the world, and then bring those ideas back to who I am and what I do and how I interact with the world, right? Is that open to other people in my... So I can't just walk in and say I'm a trans person from India without acknowledging these forms of oppression. For instance, why am I here talking to people where other people who've done better work on the ground are not here today talking to you all, right? So I think that's something also we, within our sort of oppressed identities, there are other identities that give us privilege and power over other people. And so I think that's something we should be cognizant of and talk a lot more about.
Thanks so much, Narika. Really important points about intersecting identities and how we exist with marginalization and privilege simultaneously. Thank you. Thanks for raising that. And caste in India is, I mean, gosh, solidarity to you at the moment. Go ahead, Narika.
No, this because right now one of the biggest conversations that's happening in lots of circles in India is the ongoing complete right-wing religious fundamental takeover of every form of government in the country, right? And how everybody has opposed it, but except for that privileged mass of people who are blind to what's happening around them, who don't want to acknowledge that this is happening or who benefit from this happening. And then are being said that we, the people who are opposing it are either white, are misled or are working with so-called breaking India forces and things like that. And we keep hearing these things again and again about us. At the same time, the government is pulling a lot of queer people into the right-wing scheme of things. There are lots of right-wing queer people, trans people, intersex persons who are queer, right-wing, trans people who are queer, who are right-wing, and queer people who are right-wing, and so it looks like the government is supportive of queer rights and queer politics, but are whitewashing, pinkwashing or orange washing things that are behind them, right? Using these people as shields and masks. So I think that's also something I'm very worried about.
Yeah, thank you so much. So important. Orange washing. I think that's a really great way of putting it. And then for for others' benefit, it's, you know, it's related to the citizens. Is it this? Please correct me, Narika. It's the Citizen Amendment Bill as well. Please.
Yeah. So it's now no longer a bill; it's an actual act of the government, and it's passed by the parliament, and you know, it's received the head of the state's approval, and it's except it's not implemented on the ground in most places. It's already operating in some parts of the country, but it's not, only because of COVID. And you know, that's an ironic thing. On one hand, people are dying out of COVID, people are losing jobs and are having to move places, and you know, suffer from loss of jobs and loss of incomes and loss of livelihoods because of COVID. But at the same time, right now, that seems to be helping them retain some amount of, I don't know how do we talk about this, right? So the Citizenship Amendment Act that was passed by the government in the parliament last year, it's active. There are other things that are coming, and there's mass surveillance, and then there are 3 farm acts that have been, acts reforming land use and for agriculture and things like that, and allowing of foreign direct investment and other kinds of retail investment in agriculture, which basically means that there is no support net for people who might not be owners of land but are still agricultural workers. And where do they go, and what do they do, and how do you talk to them? And so there's protests happening right now in the capital city, where farmers from across the country are being tear gassed and shot with water cannons and being called anti-nationals and things like that. But the government will use, we are, this is a very famous slogan in India, Jai Kisan, Jai Jawan, which means long live the farmer, long live the soldier. We're happy to use them, but we are happy to set one against the other.
Divide and conquer. Yeah, I mean, gosh, I don't really have any words for what's going on in India. Besides,
I mean, one can talk about it forever and ever, I suppose.
Yeah, and a lot of them are being incarcerated. A lot of your activists and academics are being incarcerated, as you said, being framed as anti-nationals and are actually being silenced by the government. It's fucked up. I'd like to open Rula, if you'd like to just come into this conversation, share some of your feedback and comments. I know you would have quite a lot to say about pink washing and orange washing, and the relative color in Lebanon. So I welcome you to just share and contribute, and then we can continue.
Thank you. What Narika was saying about homonationalism resonated a lot. So when we started this conversation thinking about South-to-South solidarity and South feminist solidarities, we were thinking from a perspective that is anti-border, and the way that we navigate the borders has a lot to do with our genders and our sexualities, and not always in the best of ways, even within what is called the ally industrial complex. So people who are assisting us in order to get to countries of immigration, for example. And this places additional burdens on a lot of people of color, queer people of color, on how do they have to seek refuge. To illustrate, I will give an example, for example, of a refugee woman, queer woman from Iraq, who has to ask for a refugee status to go to the US. And then she is required by these UN agencies to give a horror story that is based on the backwardness of her own country and her own folk, and that is rooted in the sense of, in the white supremacy sense of what that culture looks like. For example, addressing extremist organizations such as ISIS, that she's fleeing that But not only that, she was only fleeing people of her own that are not friendly towards her queerness or her transness. And this horror story and narrative needs to be so individualized for her to be granted that access to justice, because she would not simply have that chance if she is to say that, well, guess what? This ISIS that I am escaping is the product of colonialism and is the product of military occupation of Iraq, where in Camp Bucca, military zealots met with religious extremists, and they have created this organization that now not only me, based on my queerness and my transness and my choices and my freedoms and my liberties and my being and my conscience, I'm fleeing, but also they're very much targeting everybody else. And we have this dual burden that every migrant woman, even within heteronormative settings, would speak of. Every woman who is, for example, living in a country of the global north and is facing domestic violence from her partner, also a person of color, would think twice before reporting that, because that creates a narrative that demonizes migration and that demonizes men of color. And then she would have herself think on the crossroad between whether she needs to flee and escape and find her own freedom as an individual through being complicit with narratives of racism and racial capitalism that demonize entire populations of migrants and people of color, or whether she would have to bear that burden on her own and kind of sacrifice her own safety in order not to reproduce and contribute to these narratives. So homonationalism today functions in this way. We find a lot of governments pretending to take up the plights of queer folk, of trans folk. They are not doing this out of best intentions. They are doing this to whitewash the crimes that they're having, but also to appeal perhaps to a younger demographic that is aware of the multiplicities of struggles and that is not trying to preserve like certain traditions of the past or certain discrimination. And while they're upholding this homonationalism, claiming that their governments are queer friendly, they're also constructing a lot of hostile immigration policies, and they are constructing a narrative of the backwards brown people, whom only like the very few would be able to receive refuge if they are aligning with such particular linearity of progress. And in this sense, I was also thinking about, so the communities that I am part of, the queer communities that I am part of here, and I say communities in plural because, well, we're not one, we're very multiple, and we have also a multitude of struggles that we're going through, and not like Audre Lorde said, we don't live a single issue life. So, which is why our struggles manifest differently, but they would all boil down to countering this larger systemic violence that comes from patriarchy, from racial capitalism, from white supremacies. And when we think about our identities and ways of living, we cannot think of them or like dissect them without thinking of the other groups that we belong to, other like identitarian markers that are marked on our bodies, and how people perceive us, and how governments read us, and our documentation status, and our caste, and all of this. Otherwise, we would end up, what you were saying, dividing and conquering. We would not be able to foresee a justice that encompasses all. And in the sense, I feel Sister Song had a solution when they were thinking about reproductive justice, because our bodies, and it might be strange because we're talking about queer people, so like when you say reproductive, maybe to the newcomer it would seem as if reproduction is something that happens through the uterus, or bodies that have a uterus, but not necessarily. We are meant as populations to reproduce our nation and to reproduce a certain status quo, and to also reproduce the people that would carry these narratives, and to reproduce oppression, like these invisible oppressions that we're discussing today. And this happens through the demographic control of our bodies and our reproductive functions, and of our genders as well, because the world doesn't make sense in the state's mind unless it divides us into the gender binary, because the gender binary has this institution linked to it, that is the marriage institution within the heteronormative ideals, and it is meant to sustain the injustices that we're living. So for me, it boils down to thinking about how the reason, like I live in Lebanon, so Lebanon is a sectarian country where 18 different religious fractions share the rule and the governance of the country based on a demographic balance of religions, or so to say, demographic balance. So they're very wary of the change of that demography, and therefore they control migration and refugee and asylum seekers, and the xenophobia is very high, and so is racism within, for example, the population of migrant domestic workers, other historical refugee populations such as the Palestinians, people fleeing neighboring countries such as the Syrians. They sustain this racism, whereas they also sustain racial capitalism because they require this labor in order to be able to make up for the governmental failures in providing care within the state. So the way I wrap my head around this is that the same reason a cishet Lebanese woman is not able to give nationality to her child because the father is not Lebanese is the same reason that queer people are not able to marry or like publicly live their love, which is the same reason that for trans people to live within their identity, they would have to give up their ability to bear children, or they cannot have children from the past also for them to be recognized as trans. And it is the same reason why there is no civil marriage in Lebanon. And it is the same reason that migration is unwelcomed. And it is the same reason for which also for any matter that has to do with personal law, you would have to go back to your religious leader as opposed to in conventional law, because these systems are interlinked and it's not arbitrary. It's not arbitrary that a government that bans homosexuality is also a government that bans abortions. It's also a government that bans a number of other things. It's also a government that does not allow a migrant domestic worker to have a romantic life or sex and gives her regular checkups for pregnancy. It's not coincidental. And these systems of oppression function collectively, and so should we, feminists within the Global South. And this might start from like letting go a little bit of the terminologies that we have inherited from colonial histories, and to think about language justice, and to reach out to the knowledge that is produced by our own, that we were taught is not worthy of knowing, because it is the knowledge that will liberate us eventually.
Thank you so much, Rula. I'm going to hand to, I just wanted to check. I think we might have lost Anne-Marie. I just want to make sure. Yes, I think Anne-Marie has had to leave, which I'm very sad about. But Narika, over to you for any responses to Rula.
I think just maybe take some time out to cry sad lives and then wipe tears off and see how to get on with our lives. I think I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, your points about this is not arbitrary, this is not a coincidence. You said these collective systems of oppression work and function collectively. And it requires us to do the same in how we resist and advance feminist solidarity. But just to go back, I just wanted to touch on some of your points around, and it also goes back to what Anne-Marie was saying about compulsory matrimony, compulsory heterosexuality, and how that is upheld. The gender binary is upheld because capitalism relies on it, because of unpaid labor. you spoke about how while migrant populations are demonized, these migrant populations are relied upon and exploited in those countries to line the pockets of wealthy elites who we know are mostly cis, mostly white, mostly upper caste. And just an example of what you were saying about the double bind of women, or the dual burden of women as migrants. Just an example. I mean, my next door neighbor well, they've moved out now, but you know, she was being beaten by her husband. But they're from another country. There's a lot of xenophobia in South Africa, and we're told to speak out and to push back against the silence. You know, speak out against gender-based violence, when we know very well that silence protects a lot of women and queer and trans folk. That silence is a survival strategy. And when I sought help, they confirmed that domestic violence shelters in South Africa are not open to migrant populations. So my hands were tied and her hands were tied. And that silence is a survival strategy. So just to touch on some of those points, and that it really is it's like you said, it's across borders. We're experiencing this across borders. But I do want to take us to, you know, the collective systems of oppression and how they interlinked. And you spoke about how this calls us as feminists to address that interlinkage and collective functionality of these oppressions. Can you, Nadika, Rula, whoever would like to begin, it's up to you. That kind of helps us go into the next question about how do we build power and organizing? How do we reimagine internationalism and South-South feminist solidarity? And what does it mean to live and practice that? And also just going back to what Sissy had brought to the table in this conversation with kind of talking about how trans, non-binary, and queer people are excluded. Well, rather, the trans, non-binary, and queer exclusive fascists that call themselves feminists. How do we as feminists push back against that exclusion and build solidarity? So over to any one of you. The floor is open.
So one of the things that in the last few years that I've been sort of actively involved in community work and in talking to people from a rights perspective, is that the larger people who may identify as feminists, or who may not use that label for themselves, but who still sort of intrinsically follow the principles of feminism in a way. They may not know the language, or they may not use the words, or they may choose not to identify with that word, but follow that in life, in practice, and in daily life. They far outnumber the fascists out there. Except the fascists, because of who they are and what they do, they have the voice. Rather, they have the mic on hand right now. And I think the way to build that solidarity is to talk to these people on the ground, and which is one of the reasons why I've given up doing activism on Twitter or online is because I can't outshout the people who sort of have these systems to support them. For instance, Twitter or Facebook will actively boost the TERF voice, will boost the capitalist voice, will boost the cis-patriarchal voice without even knowing that they're doing it, but maybe actively knowing that they're doing it. Facebook especially, right? Your online platforms are designed in a way that aids the fascists out there, which is why I've sort of given up doing this online and I'm working offline. I'm talking to people on the ground. I'm talking to people one-on-one. I'm talking to people in classrooms, and I'm talking to people in colleges and schools, and I'm talking to people at a restaurant or a cafe or a place like that about things that matter to me, which I think resonates largely, but is not heard more. And I think that's something that we need to look at, because what we've seen Twitter aiding things like the Arab Spring and things like that. We've seen Twitter be somewhat of a voice for mobilization of the person on the ground, right? And then we think that it's going to apply across the world at all points and all times. But what we may not have learned, or what we may not have realized, is that that was an accident. And social platforms have largely been in aid of the status quo. And so I think we need to move away from there. Conferences and seminars and workshops are fantastic. They're a way for us to know, put a name and a face to other people doing similar things. But then we have to do the same thing on the ground, to the people that matter. For instance, when the lockdown was announced in India for COVID, so many trans people who were making the most meager earnings couldn't do that. They were thrown out of their houses, or they were, for the first place, getting a house as a trans person is a big trouble in India. But then with COVID and things like that, unable to pay rent and not able to, find food or whatever. So those are things that matter. And so you then go to the person who you think will help. Is that person who doesn't claim that they're a liberal feminist, but behaves in that way. Is either a social worker or a grassroots member in a communist party or things like that. Those are the people who matter when crises come, when crisis happens. Those are the people willing to support us. The anti-caste activist on the ground in a smaller state in India is probably more feminist than the person who's read the book and is claiming to be feminist on Twitter or Facebook. I think that's the sort of conversations we need to keep building to build this solidarity up.
If I might come in here. That also absolutely resonates, because I feel part of the issues that we are encountering is perhaps sometimes purposeful, perhaps sometimes unwilling, but the way that feminism alienates a lot of people because of the terminologies that we use, or because of how something with so much radical potential has been taken up by the capitalist system, and how it was commodified, and how you have people working in sweatshops selling things that say smash the patriarchy. They're obviously not going to hear from a feminist coming to them with that agenda. So we need more humility in our organizing, and we need to be listening to people and like passing the mic to people when they talk about their experiences, because they are valid regardless of what type of language they might have had access to. And by language, I mean both whether they're speaking in English, because we have had the privilege to maybe the privilege to learn it, or maybe it was taught to us by colonialism as well. So we've inherited that language as part of the legacy, but to many it's unaffordable and their knowledge gets trespassed. So this includes language justice. It's very sad to me, for example, as an Arabic speaker, that the only perhaps Arabic word that would be known across languages is something like jihad, right? Like you would recognize that word because it was adopted to English, and that means like a bloody fight and things like that were like used through the media and amplified because they also provide a statement about entire nations, entire ethnicities. But we do not hear of conceptual frameworks. Like when we think of the philosophies that we're using, we pretty much like learned philosophies from the global north, but not philosophies of the global south. We don't adopt them, and we need that shared history, like the knowledge that our ancestors have put forth in order to be able to liberate ourselves in a sense. For example, even when we think of LGBTQ communities, right? Like we have these numbers of letters that we're putting together, cramming together into an identitarian framework. In my experience, I've encountered the terminology through NGOs' work, and NGOization is also complicit in the sense of how it has to respond to certain milestones, there funder milestones that it has to be accountable to that do not necessarily reflect the realities of the people it says it's supporting. And when we are doing this, so to come back to my original point, this is when I encountered the framing of LGBTQ, but perhaps this is not how people necessarily identify as a collective of letters brought together within these identification or concepts. And we know that within our cultures, there have been different ways that people have expressed their genders, different ways that people experience intimacies, different ways their performance is in public versus in private, that it is much more fluid than this. And yet, we've inherited these frameworks from colonialism, along with the laws that criminalize these same identities. To go back, for example, to Lawrence of Arabia, like that we might have seen on TV in a movie that glorifies the guy who is actually a colonist. He writes in so many books about these filthy local native populations that indulge in horrible, horrific sexual practices with the same sex because they're because of lust and because of unholy feelings, whereas the colonist has intimate and almost dignified forms of love, and even the same kinds of intimacies. If the entire thing, we strip it down from all of the descriptives, and then we have white people having sex with the same sex or the same gender versus like native people from colonized spaces having sex with the same sex, and one is filthy and horrible and criminalized, and the other one is dignified in a sense. And yet we've adopted these frameworks with both conceptual and both legal frameworks, and we ought to break out from them, not only because of our decolonial plights, but also because it would teach us humility for one thing, and it would teach us other ways that we would be able to connect to one another outside of the rigidity of what these shells tell us that our identities should be. And then it would dismantle the systems that we are talking about, because these systems categorize us because it's easier to police us that way. And they tell us that we are man and women because it's easier to police us that way. They tell us that we are straight and gay because it's easier to police us that way. They tell us we're cis and trans because also like there are certain things allowable and disallowable. There are bodies that are disposable and bodies that are not disposable to this system. So a little bit of ambiguity and a little bit of going back to these roots, I think, would revolutionize how we relate to all of these concepts and our identities and how complex they are as well.
Thank you so much, Rula. I mean, I know Narika and I can see Narika, and we're, shaking our heads and nodding our heads. I mean, yeah, just to go back to what Narika was saying about the importance of going back to basics, organizing, mobilizing, and popular education, having conversations outside of the ones that are shaped by algorithms, which are designed by primarily cis-het white men in Silicon Valley. And then after which, as you've pointed out, Rula, we are surveilled by. And yeah, just Nadika, what you said about social media being an aid of the status quo rather than a resistance to the system. So that's, yeah, that's really key and a really important practical way in which to build South solidarity for a queer envisioning of and reimagination of our future. And just to touch on your point, Rula, about, you know, the co-optation and appropriation of feminist language, we have to keep pushing back against that. It's because they're diluting that language. And I think, and you were talking also about how that links to language justice, and how the language that we use when we talk about decolonization, we need to also decolonize the language that we use and not conform to acronyms that, yeah, police us and in many ways force us to conform to various binaries and various kind of constructed endpoints. You know, I mean, I think in many ways the LGBTQ acronym, beside it being again colonial and English, in some ways it has been used. It's been, there's a double-edged sword there. It's been used to, we've needed to almost stake claim to our identities, so we can stake claim to our specific rights. But in so doing, we've done ourselves in by conforming to this these absurd categories as well. So thank you for raising so many issues in what you said.
So
we've gone
together, by the way.
Oh,
yeah,
okay, good, thank you.
Comment on that, yeah. And suddenly there are like these sexualities, and suddenly there is a T, as if, I mean, LGBT for me really just means the G, because I don't see any B or T or even L in there most of the time, in the way that spaces are dominated, for example. So I'm happy to
exactly
doing differently here.
Yeah, so thank you, thanks for that. We've kind of run over time, but we wanted to keep this a free-flowing conversation. And to be quite fair, there aren't any questions in the chat. So I'm assuming that people are enjoying listening to this conversation. And I think this is a conversation that really does need to be heard and listened to. But I would like to open the floor just for 10 minutes to anyone who would like to raise a contribution or to raise a question for Rula and Nadika. We do welcome any questions. This is important. After which I would like to pass on to our next artist to close this amazing session. We've got a comment from Claire saying, appreciate the point because homo-patriarchy is real. There are spaces where the G does dominate in line with patriarchy. We need to push on this too. Yes. Any questions from the audience, please use your Q&A tab. Please do feel free to ask a question or share any further contributions. And of course, in the meantime, Rula, Nadika, if you have any additional points, Nadika, if you'd like to respond to what Rula had said, please feel free. You have your mic, so you feel free to unmic or unmute.
Besides completely agreeing, I think that seems to be the default response today is that we seem to be in complete agreement with what we each other said, and I think that's a good place to start things from.
Thank you, and we are in agreement, and we're from 3 different continents. Am I right? and we had Annery, sort of. We had Annery here, and that makes it well 4 or 5. So yeah, that says a lot. There is one question from Emma. If you could make one critical change to the current global migration systems, what would it be?
I can try to speak to that. Also, there is a question in the Q&A, by the way, for later from Dagmar. On the migration question, one of the attendees has said something in the chat here that was quite powerful, that migration is facilitated for capital. It's not facilitated for people. So I want to reiterate that and thank them for putting that up in the chat. And in the same way, if we think of what is criminalized, for example, many countries in Europe, in the US are adopting terminologies that are interchangeable for trafficking and for smuggling. And the purpose is to incarcerate everybody who assists a migrant who's stuck in borderland without firewalls to be able to escape a situation or like get into a better situation. By virtue of claiming that it is a crime when it is a crime against borders, I'm not even going to say land, because crime against land is occupation and colonialism. That's not that. So it's a crime against things that are drawn most frequently by colonists or rulers, depending on which part of the world we are talking. Frequently, they do disregard relationships of kinships. Frequently, they have happened through practices of war, even like in the best examples of autonomies or countries that have that had a nation and then it became a state, since we're living in the time of a nation state. We need a lot of transnational organizing and just to understand that the punitive and criminal, what is called justice system, is not here for justice. It's here to sustain the status quo, to borrow from Nadika as well. And that we need to understand that if they are certain crimes as such, they are done against these borders and not against people. So by adopting them, we are not dignifying what we should be dignifying. Yeah, that's my little 2 cents.
Thanks, Rula. Nadika, would you like to just add to that? Because I see you've been commenting in the chat, but there's also a question from you in the Q&A. I think you would be best to answer this. What ways do you see us working together with women and queer trans people from different castes? Sorry, Nadika, you are on.
Yeah, my bad. So this is something that's coming up a lot in conversations in India, but who is talking and what are they saying, right? And I think that's something, and we keep hearing the term pass the mic, pass the mic, pass the mic. I think that is something, as someone who comes from a very privileged background within the Indian context, I don't think I should be the one saying what is the method to talk to people from other castes, because obviously that's going to come with my coloring and my perspective on how I see things, and therefore there's a lot of white savior, Brahmin savior, cis privileged savior ideas of what inclusion and feminism and solidarity is, right? So I think that is something that we need to understand, and I think one of the ways I have learned a lot in the last 5 years, especially after I started transitioning publicly and socially. I've learned, because till then I was living a certain kind of a life, and while I was maybe in larger agreement with ideas of anti-caste and anti-patriarchal, anti-cis patriarchy and things like that, I may not have practiced it in my own daily life, but then I've learned And I've learned in the only way that I've learned is that I've made really stupid mistakes at times, and I've learned from people who pointed it out, called it out. And this is why I think when people react to things like cancel culture, I want to shout at their faces, because cancel culture is not cancel culture, it's collared culture. It's collared culture because we've not let people talk. So I think there's one way of doing that is to let people within our networks and within our groups and within our movements, is to let other people call out our mistakes. People who may not have the voice, or people who may have been denied the voice, rather than saying who don't have the voice. It's people who clearly have been shut down and silenced. And if they call out, I think we should just shut up and we should just listen to what they're saying, and try and incorporate what they're saying in the way we move and the way we work.
Thank you so much, Narika. I think that's a very, there's not much to, I think that's it. Just shut up and listen and give people the mic. Those that have been systematically and deliberately silenced, let's give them the mic and let's listen and learn. And I think we and a lot of people on this panel have learned a lot today. So thank you very much, Narika, Rula, and Annerie. Annerie has had to leave, unfortunately, but a big shout out to Annerie for opening this session for us and starting this conversation. I would like to hand over to our artist to close off this session. And then I'll just make some closing remarks. Let me just go back to my, we have Feriraj Mukumba, is a feminist singer from Zimbabwe. Feriraj, we welcome you. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies. My name is Feriraj Mukumba, or Fari CJ. I'm an artist, a women's rights activist from Zimbabwe, and I have been using arts in my activism work to fight for women and children's rights. Organization called My mainly focused on advocating for the rights of young girls and young people on sexual reproductive health. But I'm also part of movement, and which is I'm part of DAWA, which is called Adolescent and Young Girls Women Movement for Young Girls and Women in Zimbabwe. And my work has exposed me to work with different women from different backgrounds and sectors around Zimbabwe, in Malawi, and I was once part of an exchange program in Uganda. And I've also written plays, dramas, music, films, and I've directed films that stand for women's rights and that speak about challenges that women and girls face in different African communities. Currently, I'm working in Harare as the Theatre for Development Department Head for My Age Zimbabwe Trust. So I'm going to talk about the song, the video that will be shared shortly. It's a song that I wrote that lays out the challenges that women face in terms of different African cultural and religious practices, whereas women are not told about the challenges that they will face. In Africa, we're normally told as women that we are supposed to be strong, in as much as we are living in harsh conditions, difficulties in terms of our the challenge that a woman is facing. It's there to ask questions on how she can be able to fight the challenges that she's facing, how she can be able to also stand with men and to fight the challenges of patriarchy, challenges of the sexual abuse, gender-based violence, and so on. So I hope everyone is going to enjoy the video, and I hope it is going to leave something in your hearts, and you are going to remember this. Thank you very much.
Kubasha fababao dinongoziwimbi koamwe bari kubi sekuru pado kubasha fababao dinongoziwimbi koamwe bari kubi no chemana liko dumira naliko dumira nani shandire tanga iwe mvura umbo no chemana liko dumira naliko no mira nani shandiri tanga imwe mvura umbo sawira wenyukarai na bururu wenyuchenezo ndiyo ekandi nuziwa behu kama bari kupi muroiwe murahindi chidakwe chimarahindi nenuwe makuwa farai behu kama bari kupi muroiwe murahindi chidakwe chimarahindi newe makuwa farai behu kama bari kupi hivi makati mwanangu kura akura zito takura mutoro I didn't know that being a woman, Shimuya, Nematambutziko, Ditakure, Mutoro Norema, oh, no Chemana Nico, Dumira Nico. Shandire tanga imwe mumbura. Thank you.
Wow, I mean, that was amazing. Thank you so much. What a fantastic way to end this session. Thank you so much, Rira. That was beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Don't know what else to say.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Thanks for being here. Thank you for performing. There was amazing music. To all the attendees, please check out where Farira has put her contacts and where we can follow her. Thank you so much. It was amazing. I should have actually done the thanks before this, because that would have been the perfect ending. But now I have to, talk again. But because this is the last session that I've had the privilege and honor to facilitate, I wanted to do all the thank yous. So obviously, firstly, thank you so much to Nadika, Rula, and Anari for making it to the session and for everything that you shared with us, for your perspectives, for your labor, and also for doing this at quite short notice. So thank you so much, and we're so grateful to you, and we send you love, power, and solidarity. Thank you so much. I'd also like to just thank our participants and all the attendees. We know that it's been a bit of a rough year, and we've spent a lot of time on Zoom. So the fact that you've shown up to listen and to learn and to contribute is really amazing. So thank you. I would just like to thank again South Feminist Futures for creating this space for us to build South Feminist solidarity. Thank you so much. Thank you to the founding members, and thank you to the funders. We really appreciate that you've helped create this space. I would also like to give a shout out to Stractivate. Stractivate has been absolutely incredible, doing everything in the back end. They're working behind the scenes. I'm sure there's like sweat and tears. Maybe, I don't know if there's blood, but maybe. But you've helped us curate this festival, and you've been so supportive. So thank you so much to anyone out there who wants to do something like this in the future. Stractivate is the go-to organization. It's also Black woman led and founded. So please support Stractivate. They're incredible. Letu, thank you. Big shout out to you, and also just a shout out to. I know we're going to do this in the closing ceremony tomorrow, but I did want to shout out to Stractivate, and I also just want to say thank you to the translators on this call, and yeah, just thank you for translating this conversation. That's it from me, but just to encourage everyone that tomorrow is the last session, the last day of the festival, fortunately as well, but unfortunately. And it's going to be the closing session. It's the theme for tomorrow is reimagining development, and we've got some amazing sessions that are coming up tomorrow, and we've got really great artists scheduled for the closing session as well. So please do stay with us and join us, and do follow South Feminist Futures on social media, Twitter and Facebook. And one very last shout out to Nadika, Rula. Thank you so much. Solidarity and power to you. Thank you. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you all.